Danielle Belton. I'm editor-in-chief of HuffPost, and I'm so excited to be here with Y-Vonne to talk about her amazing book.
I'm excited as well. I can't wait to get into it.
Yes. So the book is How to Talk to Your Boss About Race, Speaking Up Without Getting Shut Down. Now, race is obviously a really touchy subject for a lot of people. It's very sensitive.
Yeah.
And so many workplaces have been trying to adapt, to racial issues and diversity issues as they come up. What advice do you have for managers and how they can make an environment that's actually comfortable for people of color, for non-binary people, for queer people, where they feel like they're heard, that they can speak up, they can talk about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth noting that a lot of times people are punished when they bring up touchy issues or issues that are tough to talk about. They do receive some pushback, they do receive some backlash, and so those fears are really well-founded. For managers, I have to say model it. Start those conversations yourself. Don't wait for an employee to bring it up to you. Proactively think about not just race, but people's identities and what their concerns may be as well, and show people how to have these kinds of conversations. And it can be really tough to model. Like I said, it's, a lot of times it's a difficult topic to tackle, but I think that's the only way where you're going to get people to have that trust, and that's really what it's about, trust, to come to you with that kind of personal pain and that kind of conversation.
No, it's, even in my own career, I've had to have some very difficult conversations with employers about racial issues, about diversity, and there's no time that I can think of where it was more complicated than in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. And a lot of companies realized that they needed to do something about diversity, about where they stood on various issues. Can you talk a little bit about that time period and how it affected you as someone who has a DEI business, ReadySet?
Yeah, I mean, that time period was wild. I talk about it in my book a little bit. So just to kind of paint a picture for you, 2020, COVID happened. Actually, no, 2019, I got pregnant. 2020, COVID happened, right? So, and the George Floyd protests started happening May of June that year. I was due to give birth in July. So you can sort of imagine where my head was. And we were talking about this backstage. There was literally a point I was on bed rest. I couldn't really walk anymore, and the phone just started ringing and ringing, and it didn't stop ringing. And people wanted to have this conversation, and they wanted to talk about the tough stuff. Like, it used to be like, people were like, let's talk about unconscious bias and how we all get along. And they wanted the touchy-feely stuff. And this time I would pick up the phone, and they'd be like, we want to talk about systemic racism. We want to talk about white supremacy. And I'd be like, whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, cool. That's great. And, let's make sure that we're getting you there at the right pace. And so it was like this huge energy around this topic. And I think it was also about so much more that was happening to us as a people at that time, with COVID, with seeing these things on Twitter, with the collective feeling of uncertainty. A lot of that came to head during the summer of 2020.
And so when you're working with these companies that are blowing up your phone, individuals who are blowing up your phone, what are you telling them? What kind of interactions? What was that like? The advice that you had to give?
I mean, the first thing I say is thank you for coming to us, and I start by acknowledging how hard this work is to do. And just to be clear, the conversations that I had 2 years ago are very different than the conversations that I'm having now, right? 2 years ago, there was this urgency, and everybody wanted to do something. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but now it's people are but we tried, we're tired, we don't have as much money. The economy is what is the economy doing? We're just trying to save the people we have. Everybody left from 2022. And so part of what I'm doing is encouraging people to continue to do this work, reframing it as a continuous process, and connecting it to other business priorities, right? There's a reason why we had the Great Resignation, and it's connected to DEI. there's a reason why employee turnover is what it is, and that's connected to DEI, right? There's a reason why companies are having problems with traction and product market fit. And a lot of that is because they're struggling to connect with consumers, and that's a DEI question, right? So my conversations today are a little bit different than they were in 2020, and it's really about maintaining that momentum and kind of giving a check on what this all is about and what it's really for.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I want to talk a little bit about your book. In it, you say you didn't get your real wake-up call until you entered the professional workforce.
Yeah.
You note, quote, "I saw my career as a culmination of all my hard work, the manifestation of my Black excellence. It was, in truth, the beginning of my failure."
Yeah.
Can you unpack that?
Yeah, it was really bad. I always struggle to answer this question because I'm like, I don't want to sound entitled. But I grew up where I was taught, you work twice as hard, you're twice as good, you go to the right schools, you get those checks by your name, and eventually it's going to be smooth sailing. And not to be that person that went to Harvard that tells everybody they went to Harvard, but I did that, and I went to Harvard. And when I graduated Harvard Law, I thought, okay, Y-Vonne, it's coasting. You did all your hard work. You put up with all the bullshit. Like, you can just, let it ride. And not like I wouldn't work, but I was like, I don't have to prove myself anymore. And I'll never forget my first job. I tell this story in the book. I was in Afghanistan because I was an international human rights lawyer. I was in Afghanistan. I was doing this research report. And when I was in my job, it was all about trying to diagnose problems, right, and paint a picture of what was going on. And I just remember I just stayed up all night working really hard, and I wrote this analysis I was really proud of. And it was like my first job, and so I super excited, no sleep. I still had energy at 25, I go to my boss, and I hand in the report, and I'm just waiting for the praise. And she comes back to my office, and she's like, "So, Y-Vonne, you know that when you quote somebody in a report, you have to cite them, and you have to show that you're quoting them." And I was like, "Yeah, I did that. I showed it here and here." And she was like, "Yeah." And then she went to the spot of the report I was really proud of. I'd worked really hard on. She was like, "But here, who said that?" And I was like, "That's me. That's all me." And I'm just sitting there waiting. And she was like, "Okay," And then she just kind of walked away. And I got the feeling that she never quite believed that that's what I could do, even though she hired me. She knew where I came from. And I talk about that because in my career, I started realizing that I wasn't done proving myself and that I was kind of on this tightrope, right? I could do too good or I could be not good enough. I had to be really friendly and really humble. I couldn't rock the boat, and it was always this delicate balance that I never quite knew how to maneuver. And, that was not going to be the first or last time that I experienced ambiguous behavior or overt bias. And I think for me, it was really hard to come to terms with the fact that there were some things in my life that I couldn't control, that my merit couldn't trump, and that people were invested in denying about my experience. And so that's what I meant by that.
No, that makes a lot of sense because, a lot of times people think, well, I've finished school, I've accomplished so much, this is it. This is going to be smooth sailing.
Yeah.
Especially if you had a good experience in school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not, but yeah.
Oh, no, you didn't. I'm so sorry. But speaking of the workplace, there's been a lot in the press around quiet quitting.
Yeah.
Where employees basically stop going the extra mile and simply just do the bare minimum. Or as I like to call it, the Marshawn Lynch method.
I love Marshawn Lynch. That's appropriate. Yes.
I'm just here so I don't get fined. But what do you think that looks like for people of color, and how do you think quiet quitting could impact them compared to their peers?
Yeah, I think it's, we've always been, I feel like, under a little bit more scrutiny. And, I don't just say that in a baseless way. There's sort of research that shows that prove it again bias exists, like what I just talked about, that people of color tend to be monitored more closely in the workplace. So I think it is harder for us to do the sort of quiet quitting, right? But I also think at the same time, when we look at what the root causes of quiet quitting are and who's getting burned out and who's frankly just tired of this hustle mentality and this grind culture with like sometimes no tangible benefit. I feel like a lot of times people of color get caught up in that. We're taught from a very early age, grind, 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 grind. That's what I was just talking about. And then we get to work and we're taught hustle, hustle, hustle. And a lot of times that doesn't pay the dividends back. And we're going up against these cultural elements that make doing our jobs even harder. And so I think, we're more likely to burn out, but we're also more likely to be under that scrutiny. What it eventually means is that you get a lot of people of color who attrit, who move out. And so when we have the diversity conversations, a lot of times it's about hire, hire, hire. It's not about retain. And you lose all of your investments in diversity when those people, instead of quiet quitting, loudly quit and just leave your organization. So that's how I think about it for people of color.
Okay.
And I also think that applies to a lot of people who are marginalized in organizations. We're talking a lot about race right now, but we could be talking about gender. We could be talking about sexuality. We could be talking about religion. We could be talking about a lot of stuff.
Definitely.
I think it affects a lot of marginalized groups in the same way.
Well, while I understand quiet quitting in theory, I'm more of like the type of person that just straight up quit.
Yeah.
If I'm not getting what I need from a job, I'm like, I'm just going to find a new one. I don't care. I'll freelance. Screw it.
I grew up in the pay your dues generation, so I own my own company now. I'm still terrified of the idea of quitting. Like, no, let's give it another shot. Let's work even harder. And, that doesn't always work. I write about that in my book, too.
I am not afraid to quit a job. I have done it many times. But I want to pivot a little bit to the recession that's looming over all of our heads. A lot of companies are already doing a lot of belt tightening right now. And how do you think that's going to impact DEI efforts?
I mean, we've already kind of seen it, right? I think, let's be realistic. The budgets are smaller. Cash is more expensive. Companies aren't getting the funding rounds. I hate to talk about this at an innovation festival, but companies aren't getting funding in the same way. And a lot of them, are still stuck in this mentality where investing in culture feels optional. Even though when we look at what's really affecting companies' bottom lines, things like attrition, that's very expensive. Things like, having a terrible public statement or having a public controversy, that's expensive. Lawsuits are expensive. But people still sort of see this investment as something that's optional. And so what's happening right now is we're seeing DEI teams, people teams get cut. And then employees are sort of left to kind of fill in the gaps. So we're seeing a lot more emphasis on employee resource groups, right? Because companies still don't have the resources to support their employees. And it's not just about racism and sexism and these challenges that relate to our identity. It's also about employee support when it comes to mental health, being a parent and trying to navigate sending your kids to school right now and showing up at work on time and fully present. ERGs, employee resource groups, employee groups, filled in that gap during COVID, and now they're even more under-resourced. And so it becomes a sort of vicious cycle where people continue to get burned out, where people leave, where people don't see necessarily the profit motive that might have kept them staying, particularly in startups, that they would have in the past. And then these startups are still running at a deficit. So, I think we're starting to realize that these teams are less optional than perhaps we may have thought in the past. And we're learning some really expensive lessons. At least that's what I'm seeing with my clients and people that are coming to us.
Mm. And another trend that I'm kind of noticing that you kind of alluded to about how the conversations have changed since 2020 and George Floyd is that some are calling it this diversity fatigue where people have become exhausted. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to talk about it. They just want to can we just move on?
Right.
How do you circumvent that? How do you get over that? How do you address that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm tired too. I would love a nap and a vacation. I think for me, I'm also an optimist. I try to see beauty in moments that may be really hard. And I think it has to be said, we're in a really hard moment right now. And I think, though, in hard moments, there's time for opportunity. People's relationship to work has fundamentally changed. There's no getting around that. People show up to their jobs in a different way. We're seeing a huge generational shift with Gen Z. and how they view their identity based on their work. Like, I came of age in the girl boss era where you were your job, you were your company, you were your hustle. Gen Z is having none of that, like, at all, you know? And I think in this shift, there's a real opportunity to say, like, how do we make this better? There's also just the economic shift where we're seeing this sort of innovation economy, VC economy, startup economy dramatically shifting towards different models, you know, away from this idea that every organization's going to be a unicorn, and really thinking about what does sustainability look like. And I think here we have an opportunity to rethink, how do we build sustainable companies that really work for the people that are in them and for the communities that are affected by them. And that takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of reflection. It doesn't happen overnight. Our current economic model took years to build, hundreds of years to build. And it's going to take time to think of something different that really benefits all of us. And so that's kind of how I try to reframe that we're at the beginning of something that could be really exciting if we take full advantage of the moment.
Oh, totally. I feel like we have an opportunity really here. I know that personally for myself at HuffPost, I've made diversity a large part of my mission in the organization. Quick anecdote. When I started at HuffPost, there were 4 African Americans on staff, and I made it number 5.
Good job.
And since I've been there over a year and a half now, we have well over 15
That's awesome.
African Americans now on staff. But it's like diversity is something you just have to do it. You just have to make it a priority. Yeah. And I always say, you know, 40% of the United States are people of color.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like 40%, that's a lot of people.
That's a lot.
And to pretend like that's niche, that's something I'll get to it when I have time.
Yeah.
That's something I'll get to when I have the budget. Is very short-sighted, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, I agree. I don't think the economies of tomorrow will look like, the companies of tomorrow will look like the companies of today. I think the companies that last, the companies that grow, the companies that flourish, particularly during this difficult economic time, are the companies that connect to consumers, the companies that connect with their employees. And as the U.S. changes, the makeup of these organizations have to change, and the culture. You know, we can't just talk about butts and seats and who looks a certain way. It's really, how do we leverage these people and the insights that they bring, and think about how do we create a more inclusive and responsive culture and more inclusive and responsive management practices that really fit this time and are going to fit what's coming down the pipeline.
Well, Y-Vonne, it was so great talking to you about this. This subject to me is near and dear to my heart and is so important. And I'm so happy that you wrote your book, How to Talk to Your Boss About Race, Speaking Up Without Getting Shut Down. Is being sold at, was it Little City? It's a tent like right nearby.
Yeah, just hop on over to that tent. I'll be signing books.
Yes, Y-Vonne will be signing her book. Please go buy plenty of them.
Plenty of them. Make it less plenty, please.
Yeah, so it's an amazing book. You'll learn so much. You'll learn how to speak to your boss. You'll learn how to make a better office space for your employees. Like, please go get this book.
And you'll learn how to take care of yourselves, because that's also a part of it, right?
Yes, so important. So thank you so much, Y-Vonne.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.